Welcome to another PureRead audiobook. It's wonderful to have you with us. Before we get started, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple and easy way ensures we can continue adding more delightful audiobooks for your listening enjoyment. The following story is copyrighted PureRead Limited, the home of books you can trust. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Shores of Darkness, Book 2 in the Warriors of the Glade Highland Romance Saga by McGill. Chapter 1. Hager squinted his eyes as he clutched the steering oar and peered through the misty sheets of rain that pelted the wooden Viking vessel. The dark clouds above him kept on pouring out their waters in an endless stream. Hager had not often seen clouds so dark. To him, they seemed like a pack of hungry wolves that surrounded the graceful Viking ship, waiting for the perfect moment to prey on the tired Viking warriors and deliver a final blow. Hager shivered and gritted his teeth. He would not give in. His woolen tunic was soaked and his long, blonde hair hung in wet, dripping strings over his shoulders. Hager turned his head. Was it getting lighter in the west? He cast a hopeful glance to the horizon. Yes, it was getting lighter. Maybe the worst of the storm was behind them. 3 days now had they been in the iron grip of Thor, the god of thunder. The waves had battered their wooden vessel and thrown them around like a bone tossed to a dog. For a long time, steering had been useless. Thor just did whatever he wanted, and the desperate Vikings had tied themselves to the sturdiest spots on the vessel or huddled together in fright. Hager had heard the mast creaking several times, but it had not broken. If the mast would break, they could prepare for Valhalla. But Hager did not want to consider that possibility. He did not yet want to go to the place of his ancestors. It was not his time to go. He wanted to go home, to the warm embrace of Thorgunna, his beautiful wife, with her long, blonde curls and her happy freckles. He wanted to see Gamli again, his 5-year-old son, and train him in the ways of the gods, and he also looked forward to the praises of his people when he could show the treasures they had captured on their raid. No, they had to survive this storm, and indeed the sky was getting lighter. Thor was merciful, they would survive. While the rain still battered his weary body, Hager had crawled out from his hiding spot and had taken hold of the steering oar again. He had no idea where exactly they were, but he knew there was a good chance the winds had pushed them close to the perilous rocks near home. Could he already see a sign of the coast? Aye, Hager, we are going to make it. A sturdy Viking warrior placed his hand on Hager's shoulder and Hager looked up. Sigrundus! Sigrundus looked wet and miserable, but his dark eyes were carrying a smile. In spite of his miserable appearance, he still looked fierce and savage. He would scare any decent merchant on an Anglo-Saxon market square. Although he was a mighty warrior, Hager didn't like the man. He was cruel and hard and almost looked more bare than human. His face was almost entirely covered by his matted hair and his long, scraggly beard was knotted in long strings. His fierce battle axe, his favorite weapon that he had used to kill countless enemies on their vicious raids, was dangling on his back. His voice was barely audible above the wind. Thor has been angry, but I think we're going to make it. Hager nodded. I hope you are right. We can't stand too much more of this. You know where we are? Sigrundus squinted his eyes. Hager tilted his head. I do not. The winds must have blown us way off course. It's getting lighter, Sigrundus added as he pointed towards the west. For a moment I was afraid we were going down. Hager grinned. I did not know you knew the meaning of fear, Sigrundus. Nah. Of course I don't. Sigrundus cast Hager an angry glance. But it would have been a shame to see all our treasures go down to the belly of the sea. We had such a good raid. After all, we are not fighting to feed the gold to the fish, and I especially did not want that beautiful Fleljad, this woman, to disappear into the sea. She's going to be my wife. MacChonaill, Hager. Hager shook his head. You still want to marry that woman? What about your lover, Ingjabjörn? Sigrundus spat on the floor just as the ship was lifted up again by a wave, and he had to steady himself. Ingjabjörn is nothing to me. She bores me. Hager held a tight grip on the steering wheel as the ship went down again, and a new wave of foamy seawater was cast over them. But he kept on talking as if nothing had happened. I don't like it, Sigrundus. You don't know this Fleljad. She doesn't even speak our tongue. But she is beautiful. I've never seen such beauty. He turned to Hager and raised his bushy eyebrows. His dark eyes glinted. Maybe you are just jealous, Hager. But I found her and she will bear me many children. Hager cast Sigrundus a tired glance. Of course I am not jealous, I am married, remember? Sigrundus burst out laughing. So ... and that will stop you. There's something strange about this woman, Hager went on. I just don't trust her. Besides, you need more than just a pretty face to make you happy. Sigrundus shook his head. Not me. Beauty is all I want. From the day I found this Feljad, I knew she would be my wife. Hager couldn't care less who Sigrundis married, but there was something odd about the woman Sigrundis had caught. He recalled how Sigrundis had been so excited when he found her near a house on one of their raids. He had just put a house on fire when he spotted her near a tree. She had tried to run away, but was no match for Sigrundis, and he had caught her. He had slung her over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes. I found my Kona, he had said when he rejoined his fellow warriors. I like her and she will be mine. That was the day they had raided some sort of worship center for an unknown god that hung on a cross. Those Anglo-Saxons were stupid people. Why worship a god on a cross? Thor would never allow himself to be nailed to a cross, and neither would Loki. In fact, none of the hundreds of gods that Hager worshipped would want to be hammered to a piece of wood. Hager did not understand it, but then Sigrundis had shown up with that woman and she was strange. When Sigrundis cast her in the dirt before them and claimed her as his own, she had looked up at him with such defiance it had caused Hager to shiver. Her piercing blue eyes did not show any fear, and she seemed to despise them all from the depths of her being. Even though her long brown curls were matted and full of mud, she was indeed beautiful. A bath would do wonders for her, but in spite of her ragged appearance, her torn clothes, and the smudges of dirt on her face, she was still radiant and reflected a beauty that was rarely seen. Hager had seen many defenseless women before, most of whom had hated him. But their looks had been different. There was something about this woman that unsettled him. In spite of her hatred, this woman possessed a certain dignity that made her look like a queen. She's strong, Hager had said that day. I like that, Sigrundis grinned. She is full of fire. You don't know her, Hager had cautioned him. There's something about this Feljad that I don't like. It's almost as if she's from somewhere else, another world, or maybe she's a witch from that stupid god that is hanging on a cross. So what Sigrundis argued, their god is powerless and so is this woman. She will be my Kona. He pulled the woman up from the ground and began to kiss her. But that was easier said than done, as the blue-eyed Feljad saw her chance and kicked Sigrundis with her knee between his legs. He grunted and loosened his grip as he stared at her in surprise. The Vikings laughed. She's too strong for you, Sigrundis, a warrior shouted. She's like a wildcat. She will scratch your eyes out, but Sigrundis smiled a painful smile. She has spirit. I like that in a woman, he said while he was still panting from the blow. I will call her Vigor, and he pointed at the woman as he repeated the words, Vigor. But the woman raised her fist and shook her head. No, Vigor, no, Skye O'Cain. What is she saying? Another warrior scratched his head. Skye O'Cain? What does that mean? Sigrundis lifted his shoulders. Who knows, but I don't care. For now, I will tie Vigor up until I have broken her. He tied Vigor's hands with a rope and chained her to a wagon that they had found and had stuffed full of treasures. That was almost a week ago now, and Hager had been very cautious around the woman. Thankfully, they were almost home and he could forget about it. He intently peered through the mist before him again. Where's the land? If only I would see some land. Other Viking warriors climbed out of their hiding places as well, and even though the sky right above was still ominously dark and the rain continued to come down with great force, they all were hoping the worst was behind them. Where are we? Hager whispered more to himself than to Sigrundis and was contemplating calling on the help of Njord, the god of the sea. What did you say? Sigrundis asked while the ship went down again on the surge of a wave. I didn't quite, but he couldn't finish his sentence, for out of nowhere there was an enormous flash of light. It shot through the sky, and some of the terrified Viking warriors cried out in fear and threw themselves on the deck. For a moment it lit up the sky with a strange, bluish light and stood before them in the waters like a pillar of light. It was unlike anything the warriors had ever seen, and it was so intense that the Vikings had to cover their eyes. The gods have come down to punish us for our sins, a fat warrior shouted. We are going to Valhalla. And then, just like that, it was gone and the darkness closed in on them again. But Hager had seen enough and whispered a prayer to Odin. While the flash of light had frightened him, it had also shown him exactly where they were. Right before them were enormous, jagged rocks that towered above them as sentries in the roaring waters. What Hager had been so afraid of was just about to happen. The winds had blown their vessel right to the rocks and they were going to crash. Moments later, there was the sound of an ear-deafening crash and the splintering of wood. They had rammed into the rocks. The mast creaked and swung and then gave way. Hager saw it happening. Watch out, he screamed, but he was too late. The next thing he knew was the strange sensation of cold and foaming seawater that was gurgling all around him. Then all became dark. Chapter 2. Toby could not remember the last time that he had such a headache. If he moved even an inch, the pain cut through his head like a knife. Better to lay still and not move. Where was he anyway? He tried to remember what had happened, but his mind was in a fog and everything moved ever so slowly. Don't move, Toby. He felt nauseous and tasted earth. He opened one eye and tried to peer out without having to move his head. No wonder he was tasting sand. He was lying right in a puddle in the mud, and he had hit his head on a rock. How had he gotten here? Pain or no pain? I've got to get up. I must find Skye. Skye? The thought of her name brought back some memories. In spite of the pain, Toby forced himself to sit up. He almost fell over again as his head was pounding so badly, but he resisted it and steadied himself against the rock that he had hurt his head on. Now he remembered, he and his brothers were on a mission to find their wives. He needed to get up. He spit out some dirt and gently rubbed his head. He felt an enormous swelling, but there was no blood. Come on, Toby. Get yourself together. After rubbing his head for a few minutes, he could think more clearly. He remembered again how he and his brothers had discovered these strange, mystical glowing stones. They had seen faces in them, warriors, kings and knights. But ladies too. There had been music too, strange sounds of the bagpipes. Toby looked around. The field he was lying on looked a lot like the open glade where Tearlach had just married him. But it couldn't be the same, for the magical stones were not here. And where were his brothers? There was no trace of them. Maybe he should call them. He took a deep breath and cried out with full force, Hamish ... William, where are you? He listened intently, but nobody answered. All he heard was the lonely sound of the wind blowing through the trees and a soft dripping, gentle rain. Hamish, William, I am here. Nothing. Now he recalled again how the three of them had stepped inside the circle of the glowing stones. Everything had started to turn faster and faster and faster, and then nothing. He couldn't remember anything else. Just that he woke up here in the mud. Oh God, please help me. Although Toby never had much time for religion, he did have a healthy respect for the god of Tearlach, the wise man of their village, and since he didn't even know where he was, he could sure use all the help he could get. Tearlach. Thinking of the old man brought back more memories. The man had warned them against getting married. He had said that the signs were bad, although he himself had not understood. He should have listened. They all should have listened. Now they had to pay the price for their stubbornness. He shivered. Even though it wasn't raining very hard, his clothes were soaked and Toby let out a deep sigh. He had to do something. He couldn't stay here. Maybe he could find a farm or an inn and they could tell him where he was or show him the way to Gill O'Bain's, his beloved town. With great difficulty, Toby forced himself to stand up and massaged his arms and legs. Then he inspected if his sword was still in the right place. At last he wiped some wet strands of hair out of his face. Ready. All right, Toby, where to now? He scanned the immediate surroundings. The glade was remarkably similar to the one with the mysterious stones that he and his brothers had seen only hours earlier. Or was it longer? Toby shook his head in frustration. Who was to tell what was happening? Ahead of him were fir trees, just like the ones he knew so well from Gill O'Bain's, although they seemed darker. The mystical stones were replaced by a few scattered boulders. He shivered again, but this time it wasn't because he was cold. He just didn't like this place. It almost felt as if the whole area was covered by an oppressive blanket of darkness. When he peered over the grassy field, he spotted a path on the other side. A path would lead somewhere and he would find answers. Thus, Toby crossed the field, and soon he entered the forest on the other side. The trees were thick, and the leaves and the overhanging branches only let a little bit of light through. Thus it was damp and musty, and it was a difficult and narrow crossing. But soon the path became a bit bigger and the travel became fairly easy, and at one point he stumbled upon a deer. The animal had been so absorbed in drinking from a brook that he hadn't noticed Toby's coming. For a moment they stared into each other's eyes, and then the deer took an enormous leap and disappeared out of sight. Better be careful of wolves, Toby reminded himself and pulled out his sword. But nothing happened, and after another hour Toby noticed the trees were getting less thick and more light came through the canopy of leaves. And then, just like that, he was out of the forest. Before him, stretched out as far as the eyes could see, were cool highlands. Wherever he looked, Toby saw jagged rocks, thorn bushes and tufts of grass that seemed to be competing with each other for the best places to grow. On a sunny day in springtime, this could be a beautiful spot, but not today. Today, the place with the overhanging grey clouds was gloomy, and especially foreboding. Oh God, where am I? Then, just as if the Almighty himself was at work, Toby felt the inspiration to look to the right. There, in some distant valley, half hidden behind some bushes, he spotted a cabin made of wood. Someone was obviously at home, for a chimney, made of crude stones, let out clouds of swirling smoke. Toby's heart leapt for joy. Thank God. Now I can find out where I actually am. He ran down the hills as fast as he safely could. A couple of times he fell down, and at one point he even landed in a thistle bush. He let out a scream and uttered a word that Skye would not have approved of, but since Skye wasn't around and he did hurt himself, he did not care. Before long, the house, which appeared to be a farm, came in sight. A border collie came around the side of the house and started to furiously bark, and was baring his teeth. "It's all right, boy. I mean no harm," Toby whispered. The door swung open and a husky man with a bald head and an enormous moustache appeared, who stared at him with questioning eyes. Behind him stood a young man who clutched a javelin in both of his hands, ready to throw it at him if the big man would say the word. Toby realized he looked awful and rather suspicious. He raised both of his arms in surrender. "I come in peace. I mean no harm." The big man studied him for some time and finally nodded. The young man lowered his javelin. "I can't be too careful these days," the man muttered. "You may come in for a moment." He opened the door wide and invited Toby with his head. He stepped inside and was met by a wave of comfortable warmth. The young man placed the javelin in a corner of the room and offered Toby a place at the table near the open fire. "Welcome, stranger," he said in an accent that Toby did not recognize. "You want some ale? Maybe some food as well? You look awful and you can probably use some food." Toby nodded in gratitude. "Thank you, friends. I will repay your kindness as soon as I can. My name is Toby MacChonaill, son of Bran MacChonaill, from Gilbanes." Toby looked into the puzzled faces of the two men. They did not seem to recognize any of the names. Strange. After all, the clan MacChonaill was well respected and widely known in the area. "Never heard of it," the husky man finally answered as he sat down opposite of Toby. He pulled on his bushy eyebrows while he stared at Toby with his dark brown eyes. "My name is Douglas MacNill, and this is my son, Ringan." He pointed at the lanky young man who placed some ale before Toby and a chunk of bread. He had short, blonde curls. His friendly blue eyes studied Toby with great curiosity. Toby smiled at him. "Thank you." Then he tore off a piece of the bread and began to chew. "Are you coming from far?" Toby MacChonaill Ringan asked. Toby swallowed his food. "No, just from Gilbanes. Can you tell me how to get back there?" He was met with silence and Douglas MacNill cast a glance at Ringan. Finally, Douglas spoke up. "Where is this Gilbanes?" Toby looked up and raised his eyebrows. "You really have never heard of Gilbanes? And what about my father, Bran MacChonaill? Surely you must know that our clan is one of the most important families in all of the north of Scotland." There appeared a slight smile on Ringan's face. "Well, my friend, judging by that bump on your head, somebody must have knocked your senses to the depth of Loch Ness. We are in the north of Scotland, but there's no MacChonaill here. This is the land of Fitzduncan." "Fitzduncan? You heard me. I know Fitzduncan." Toby was relieved. "Only a few weeks ago I fought under Fitzduncan against the English." The English Ringan raised his eyebrows again. "We've got no quarrel with the English," Douglas added. "You must be confused with the Norsemen, those savages that raid our coastline." He lifted his mug of ale, brought it to his lips and gulped down its content. Then he put it down again with a satisfied sigh and licked his lips. "Elbert Fitzduncan," he continued, "may be the most powerful man around, but he's a coward. He's fighting no wars. He doesn't even want to kill a fly. It's his generals that do the fighting for him." Toby was too surprised to even touch his own ale. "You say? Elbert Fitzduncan?" "Yeah, Elbert Fitzduncan. Who else?" Douglas answered while he tapped the table with his fingers. "I don't know any Elbert Fitzduncan. I've fought under Powley Fitzduncan." Ringan looked at his father and said nothing. Douglas pulled on his eyebrows again and stared long and hard at Toby. Finally, he spoke up and said, "All right, Toby MacChonaill, or whatever your name may be, you had better start telling me your story, and if I don't like what I hear, you may end up at the end of my son's javelin." He nodded at Ringan, who grabbed his spear again and pointed it at Toby. "Talk, MacChonaill. Tell us your story." Chapter 3. At first, Skye did not know where she was when she opened her eyes. Her clothes were soaking wet and she tasted sand and salt. From somewhere far away she heard people talk, but she couldn't make out any of the words. For a moment she kept herself totally still and tried to remember. Her head felt heavy and her body ached all over. Above her the sky was grey and overcast, but it did not rain. The clouds were thick and dark, just the way she felt. How did I get here? She scraped with her fingers in the ground around her. Sand. She was on the beach? Now she heard the crashing of the waves against the shore in the distance too. Was she hurt? She mentally checked her body, but nothing in her body appeared to be broken. At last she lifted her head and looked around. Some 20 feet away she spotted a group of bedraggled men huddled around a fire, and they were speaking in soft tones in a language she did not understand. Vikings, they were Vikings. Now it dawned on her where she was. She had been captured by these horrible savages. That one horrible brute of a Viking had captured her and even tried to kiss her. But she had kicked him right where it hurts. Then he had thrown her inside the belly of their boat and tied her and some other women that they had captured to a wooden crate. It had been awful. That boat stank like sweat and raw filth, and there had been nothing to eat. She remembered it clearly now. They had been in a storm, a terrible storm, and then there had been a terrible crash. The women next to her screamed in fright. There was water everywhere. Cold, salty seawater was streaming in and threatened to drown them all. But she was no longer tied to the box. She could move freely. Somehow, because of the crash, her ropes had broken. A young woman next to her was yelling for help while the water was rising fast. Skye had tried to jerk her loose. I must help her. I cannot let her die. She could still see the panic-stricken face of the young woman and remembered the sense of relief she felt when she had managed to free her. But then, she could not remember anything. Everything became blurry. Somehow, she must have survived the crash together with some of these Vikings near the fire. Adrenaline shot through her body. She may have survived the crash, but she was still in the grip of these Vikings. I have to get away from them. All her nerves were on full alert. Her muscles tensed and she started to move ever so slowly. Dear God, help me. Ask vet ik standa, heiter Yggdrasil, Harbadmar, Ozen, vigor. Skye froze. Those brutes had spotted her. They seemed to have some uncanny sense that warned them of any unusual movement. One of them jumped up and ran up to her. It was the brute that had tried to kiss her. He smiled a menacing smile with his dark eyes and rudely grabbed her by the shoulders. Pain shot through her body as he jerked her to her feet. Get away from me, you monster, you horrible one, Skye protested loudly. Pottist eki budadrotir, Vigor the brute said. His hair was still dripping wet, and in spite of the shipwreck, Skye could still smell that distinct smell of his that made her think of rotting garbage. It made her sick in the stomach. Huna Rikur joined Luna. Sigrundus, another Viking, got up and walked up to them. He seemed not nearly as fierce, and at least he had some resemblance of being somewhat civilized. He put his hand on the brute's back and shook his head. Glapa spertir budaslapar. The brute sighed and gritted his teeth. He apparently agreed with whatever his Viking crony had told him. Then he raised his finger and shook it in Skye's face. He did not need to say anything for Skye to know what he meant. If you try to escape, I will deal with you in the Viking way. Then he turned and slapped his friend on the shoulder. Hager, vigor I thais vid skakasir. The other nodded and pulled his friend back to the fire. Skye sighed and dropped to her knees. Where in the world was she? Where were Toby and Tierlach, and how could she escape from these brutes? Tears did not come easily to Skye, but right then she broke and let her tears freely flow. She turned her back to the men around the fire. They would not see her cry. When Toby had finished his story, Douglas MacChonaill said nothing for quite some time. He just stared in the fire. Ringjin shifted uneasily on his chair and pulled first on his ear and then on his nose. At last Douglas got up and walked over to the hearth and cast a new log on the fire and shook his head. This is quite a strange story, Toby MacChonaill. Quite strange indeed. Tell me about it, answered Toby while he bit his lips. Another long silence fell over the room, but then a flash of inspiration seemed to have hit Ringjin and his eyes shone. I remember now, I have heard of such mysterious stones, father. Douglas turned to his son. You have? Where? My friend Eidard. He has been to the Abbey of the island of Iona. Remember how that wise man from Ireland came a few years ago to our area and how he preached about a new god that he called the Christ. Eidard followed that god and went to Iona to learn more about it. Ringjin became quite animated and waved his arms in the air as he spoke. When Eidard came back from that visit, he was different. You remember that, father? You even called him superstitious. But what he said made a lot of sense to me. He spoke about forgiveness and about a place called heaven. But he also talked about strange and mysterious stones that shone with an unearthly light. He did. Toby jumped up. Where is this Eidard? A look of pain swept across Ringjin's face. He died last year. He was a good friend, and we talked a lot about such things. But last year, the Vikings raided our shores and plundered a shrine where he was serving his god. You mean a monastery? Toby asked. Ringjin shook his shoulders. I don't know what a monastery is, but what I do know is that Eidard is dead and Iona is still there. Toby stared at Ringjin and felt dizzy. A wise man from Ireland, Iona, the mysterious stones. This was too much to take in. His father Bran had told him that the wise man of their village of Gilbanes was related to an ancient saint from Ireland, who had indeed founded an abbey on the island of Iona hundreds and hundreds of years ago. What was his name again? Clumbumbus? Clomuma? Ever so slowly the name came back. Columba. His name was Columba. What was the name of the wise man from Ireland, he asked. Not, was Ringjin answered. He is still there, and so are the mysterious stones. His name is Columba. If some warrior would have hit Toby on the head with a mighty sword, the blow would not have had a greater impact than the words of Ringard. He stared in disbelief at Ringard. Saint Columba is the one who introduced Christianity to Scotland hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and now this person is alive? Big drops of sweat appeared on Toby's forehead. He got up, but his legs didn't seem to want to hold him up, and he stumbled around while he tried again to grab hold of the table. His breath came in short little gasps. Are you all right? Toby MacChonaill asked with some concern in his voice. Toby shook his head. I don't know what is happening. He sank down again on his chair. I have heard of this Columba. I have heard of Iona, only. How could he say this? This has happened hundreds of years ago. Columba is long dead, and one of his descendants, the man, Terlach, that I told you about, just married me a few days ago. The gods are messing with us, mumbled Douglas. Toby raised his arms in desperation. I think I am losing my mind. He let his head drop down on the table and moaned. Was it possible that through some weird altering of the elements he had been shot back in time? How could he ever find Skye again, and what about his brothers? And where was Gilbanes? You need to leave this house. Douglas' voice was sharp and demanding. You bring bad luck, Toby MacChonaill. The wrath of the gods is on you. Toby looked up with glistening eyes and lifted his hands once more in confused desperation. But I don't know what to do. I seem to be stuck in a different time. Let me at least spend the night here so I can get some rest and figure out my next move. But Douglas would not have it. You have to leave now, MacChonaill. This house is going to be cursed if you hang around. Then Ringjin spoke. No, father, we have to help him. How? Both Douglas and Toby looked up in surprise, and Douglas raised his eyebrows. What do you mean, son? Like I said, Ringjin answered with a steady voice. We must help Toby. His eyes were full of determination. You may not know this, father, but I too am a believer in the god of Columba. I have spoken much about this with Eidred while he was still alive, and although I don't know much about our friend Toby here, his story sounds true. I believe the god of Columba wants me to help him. Douglas gritted his teeth and glared at his son. Are you out of your mind? You will anger our gods. They will send fire from the sky. That won't happen, Father Ringjin answered with a smile. The god of Columba is way stronger than these other gods. But please do not be angry, father. I will be back. Back. Back from where? Back from helping Toby to get to Iona and to those mysterious stones. Ringjin pressed his lips together. Douglas stared at his son with open mouth. Go with Toby MacChonaill. You don't even know him. And, Hand, who will feed the cows if you are gone? You will, Father Ringjin answered with a slight nod of his head. I can't explain it, but I feel I just have to go with Toby. This is something I must do, father. Now it was Douglas' time to sink down on his chair. He shook his head and mumbled something about the gods being angry again. Then he looked up and with a cold stare he said, Serve me some ale, boy, a real big one. Hager stood on the shore and looked out over the choppy sea. 12 of his warriors had drowned, and the few that remained alive were cold, hungry and discouraged. Where was he to go? What was he supposed to do? He didn't even know where he was. He wished he could reach the gods better. He needed help and guidance. He needed Odin's strength and the wisdom of Thor, but he couldn't properly reach them. He tried to speak to them sometimes, but he knew he had no right to approach any of his gods, so he usually stopped talking as soon as he had started. After all, the gods could only be reached through the proper rituals and then only in the proper places and settings. A deep sense of loneliness filled his heart as he peered over the vast ocean. Where in the world are we? If only he could see the high cliffs of his homeland. But he couldn't see anything that resembled his own country. He only saw those evil sharp rocks that had destroyed their boat, and although he had thought they were close to home, it had all been an illusion. They were far, far away from home. The wind had thrown them way off course, and they were back where they had started. He was not going to see his beautiful wife for a long time to come. In fact, it almost appeared Valhalla was closer than he wanted to admit. He turned to look at the bedraggled group of his warrior friends. Only 10 of them were left. Sigrundus noticed Hager looking at them. What are you staring at? He sneered. Do something, rather than watching me. Get us a boat or something. He got up and walked up to Hager. We can't stay here. The gods are not favorable. His voice was cold. Hager knew that Sigrundus was only loyal to himself, but what he said was true. This trip had been a disaster. The gods were against them. They had lost their boat, the lives of much of their men, and all their treasures were scattered on the ocean floor. You are right, Sigrundus. Hager turned and walked back to the others. We must find food and supplies and find our way back home. It's the only thing we can do. Glad you think so, Sigrundus answered. We need a boat. Hager nodded. We are still strong enough for a small raid. Sigrundus barked out some orders to the other warriors. They looked up at him with tired eyes, but one after the other, they got up. Come on, Sigrundus ordered. It's survival time. If all goes well, we'll have roast meat tonight. The men nodded. It sounded good. What about the woman? Sigrundus Hager asked. What about her? Sigrundus raised his eyebrows. Let her go, Sigrundus. We can't drag her around. She will be a stumbling block and may even turn on us in the midst of battle. Sigrundus shook his head. No, she won't. I will tie her hands. I told you she's going to be my Kona. She will come. Besides, if we let her go, she will warn an unsuspecting farmer and ruin our chances of an easy victory. Hager pressed his lips together. She will bring us bad luck, Sigrundus. But Sigrundus glared at Hager. You are just jealous, Hager. But she is mine and she will come along with me even as far as Valhalla. Toby and Ringjin left the next morning at the crack of dawn. Ringjin assured his father that he could feed the cows just as well as he had, and that he would return if he could. He had packed some bread and smoked bacon in a sack that he carried in a pouch, and was in good spirits. Aye, this is a fine morning, my friend Toby, he said in a cheerful voice as they crossed through a grassy field. Just a few more miles and we'll be at the coast. The view is absolutely magnificent. Toby grunted. He had little eye for the beauty around him. Of course, he was glad that the sun shone and that it wasn't raining, but he wasn't on this journey for any other reason than to find Skye and then his way back to Gilsbane's. The realization that he had somehow ended up in a different time was unsettling at best, but he was grateful for the help of his new friend Ringjin and decided it was best to make some small talk to kill the time while they were traveling. You said you believe in the god of Columba, he asked Ringjin. Ringjin nodded. I can't say I know the god of Columba very well, but what I have heard from Eidard, he sounds so much better than the gods of my youth and that my father, Dudlas, is still worshipping. The gods of my youth are cruel and selfish, but Eidard taught me about the Prince of Heaven, who is love and wants to forgive us all. Eidard read a book that contains the life story of the son of the god of Columba. Toby nodded. I know. The son's name is Jesus. Ringard looked up in surprise. You heard about it too? Sure, Toby thought for a moment. That book you talked about is called the Bible. The Bible, Ringjin asked with a tone of deep respect. How do you know? Have you read it? Toby shook his head. No, I haven't. I believe it is written in Latin. I don't even read at all, but I have heard about it from our wise man. Who is your wise man? Ringjin wanted to know. Toby lifted his shoulders. If it was really true that he was living in a different time, then what was the use of sharing useless information with Ringjin? Still, Ringjin had proven to be a true friend, so why not tell him? His name is Terlach. They say he is a descendant from St. Columba. So, Ringjin's voice trailed off. You really are from a different time then. Toby pressed his lips together. It appears so, my friend. But if you can help me to get to Iona and I can talk to Columba myself, maybe he knows a way to use those same mysterious stones to shoot me back, and he can help me to find my dear wife. Is she beautiful? Ringjin asked. Who? Your wife, of course. Toby smiled. Sorry, I am still a bit confused by everything that is happening. But yes, she is the most beautiful woman you have ever seen. She's fairer than the early morning rays, and she is as mysterious as the fog on a grassy field in spring. I would like to meet her, Ringjin said. He sighed, and then he added, it must be beautiful to have a wife. Toby grinned. Well, it's not without problems. I have only been married for a few days and already I find myself in another time, and I am more confused than ever. Right then they reached the shore. Ringjin had not said too much. The view was magnificent. They stood on the grassy edge and were overlooking the vast ocean. Way down, maybe as far as 100 yards down, they spotted the beach. It consisted of a small strip of yellow sand and some rocks that stood unmoved in the roaring surf. Hundreds of seagulls were soaring over the waters looking for small fish and crabs. This place is indeed impressive, Toby said. I've never been here. What's this place called? Obarchiarder, Ringjin answered. But maybe it doesn't exist anymore in your time. Toby shook his head. Was he losing his mind? At last he asked, where's Iona? Way over there, Ringjin pointed to the left. It's still a long ways off. We may reach the shores in about a week. Then we'll have to take a boat from there. Well, Toby said, let's go then. In that case, we've got no time to lose. The group of Viking warriors stealthily walked over the sandy beach, looking for any sign of life. Sigrundus had taken the lead and walked a few yards ahead of the small group of warriors with steady steps. He was dragging Skye, or Vigor, as he called her, along by a rope. The poor woman stumbled and fell many times, especially when they had to climb over slippery rocks and her knees were badly bruised and scraped. But Sigrundis didn't care. "Have a bit of mercy," Sigrundis Hager asked after she had fallen again, but Sigrundis just laughed. "If we toughen her up, she'll bear me tough sons," he replied with a chuckle. But Skye wasn't about to let the brute have the best of her and climbed up again without even making a sound. Hager shook his head, but just let it be. He had other things on his mind. At one point, the beach took a sharp turn to the left. Sigrundis stopped abruptly and raised his hand. The other warriors stopped. "Look," he whispered. "There's a farm." As Hager looked, he saw what Sigrundis had seen. Right on a bluff was a farm. Several cows were grazing in a nearby pasture on a hill and smoke was whirling out of the chimney. They will have food and treasures, maybe even a boat. Another Viking warrior pointed to the left. Sigrundis and Hager followed his gaze, and indeed, there, tucked away behind some rocks, was the front of what appeared to be a sturdy fishing boat. "That will do," Sigrundis smiled. "It's not what we are used to, but then again, we are not with that many anymore, and we don't need a big boat." Hager nodded. "It may work. But first, we'll burn this place to the ground and get some good food and ale," Sigrundis said with a hateful smile. "Let's see if we can find out where we even are," Hager said, but Sigrundis shook his head. "We are where we are, my friend. If the gods want us back home, we'll find it. Right now, I've got more important business to take care of." "Yeah," mumbled the other warriors, "we need food and ale." Sigrundis yanked on the rope that was attached to Skye. She fell over again and landed in the sand. "Tie her up," Sigrundis barked. One of the Vikings sprang into action. The man grabbed her legs and started to tie them together. Skye kicked and began to scream, but Sigrundis wouldn't have it. He threw himself down next to her on the sand and placed his strong and sweaty hand around her mouth. "Quiet, my little Kona, or you may betray us." He motioned for another warrior to hand him a piece of cloth which he tied around her mouth. "We are almost ready for battle," he said with a satisfied grin as he looked at the helpless figure of Skye. "I will tie you to this rock, my little Kona. You wait here, we'll be back before you know it, and then we will celebrate." Then he lifted his battle axe from his shoulders, while the other warriors took their swords. "All right, men, we are ready for the kill." Skye looked on in desperation. Her eyes were as big as saucers, but there was nothing she could do. Chapter 5. "Do you know any other song?" Toby asked after Ringjin had sung him some of his favourite Scottish songs. Ringjin was a good singer and had a deep baritone-like voice that echoed against the rocks. Travelling with Ringjin was pleasant, and it relieved some of the pressure Toby felt. According to Ringjin, they were making good progress, especially since they had climbed down by a stone path to the beach and were now walking alongside the sea. "Much quicker this way," Ringjin had said. "There are many uncrossable gorges up there on the cliffs, but down here we can wade through the water whenever necessary." The high cliffs were now on their left, and since it was high tide, they only had a small strip of sand that they could walk on. Another song. Sure, Ringjin thought for a moment. How about this one? "A morn of May, when fields were gay, serene and charming was the weather, I chanced to roam some miles frae home, far o'er yon muir, amang the heather." "I know that song," Toby said in amazement. A deep longing for his hometown welled up in Toby's heart. How good it was to hear a song from home. Wherever that was, a small lump formed in his throat, but Toby pushed it away and joined Ringjin in his song. "O ere the muir amang the heather, o ere the muir amang the heather, how healthsome 'tis to range the muirs and brush the dew from vernal heather." "You sing well," Ringjin smiled at Toby, who was still battling with his emotions. Toby nodded as he looked down at the sand. "I like to sing. My brothers and I are often singing." "Are your brothers here too?" Ringjin wanted to know. Toby shrugged. "I don't know, when we stepped into the circle of the magic stones we were still together, in our own time, but then..." He pursed his lips and shook his head. "I have no idea." Just as Ringjin wanted to start another song, he stopped in his tracks and motioned for Toby to be quiet. "You see that?" "See what?" answered Toby as he looked up. The beach had just taken a turn to the left, and there in the far distance they could see a cloud of smoke. "Some house is on fire," Ringjin whispered. Toby bobbed his head. "Aye, you are right. There's too much smoke for just an ordinary fire. What do you think it could be?" "It's a farm. It may be MacDungus farm." "A farm? On the beach?" Ringjin shook his head. "The cliff goes down there. MacDungus is the only one living around here. His farm is built on a bluff." "No more singing from now on," Toby whispered. "Wouldn't we be safer back up on the cliff?" he added. "Here at the beach there's no way we can hide or defend ourselves if need be." Ringjin agreed. About 50 yards further down, he whispered, there is a rocky path that will lead us back up to the cliff. Then, let's go up. Soon they found the path up. It was indeed small and rather slippery, and the stones were overgrown by nettles and thistles, which did not make their climb any easier. But they both made it safely, and when they got to the top, they had a much better view of the whole area. Ringjin bit his lips. It's as I feared, he sighed. Someone has attacked McDungus and put his farm on fire. Toby's heart started to pound. English. English, Ringjin raised his eyebrows. Of course not. We are at peace with the English. Well, I am not, Toby answered with a scowl. In my time they are bad news, so they couldn't be so great in this time either. Ringjin shrugged his shoulders. They are Vikings. Vikings. What are Vikings? Toby whispered. You never heard of Vikings? Ringjin stared at Toby. They are Norsemen, you know, savages. They are cruel and uneducated. They plunder and steal and attack our coastline. Toby marveled. Well, in that case, we need to stop them. Toby drew his sword. But Ringjin placed his hand on Toby's arm. Careful, Toby, they are very fierce. They kill anyone who stands in their way. In that case, I would like to meet them, Toby shot back. I am a seasoned warrior, and I am most certainly not afraid of some Vikings. Ringjin bit his lip. But I am. I'm no seasoned warrior like you. A big grin appeared on Toby's face. Don't worry, Ringjin, I won't do anything foolish, and I won't put you in danger. Still, we need to look. These Vikings, as you call them, have probably already left, and we may need to help McDungus and his family. Ringjin nodded. You are right, Toby, but let's be very careful. We will, Ringjin, we will, Toby said with a smile. He may have gotten stuck in a different time, but in whatever time he was, he could still use his skill as a fighter. A good fight would make him feel right at home. As they came closer to the plume of smoke, they started to smell the scent of burning wood. Strangely enough, it was mixed with the smell of roasted meat. Now, they could hear voices too, and there was laughter and shouting from somewhere behind a grassy hill. Both Toby and Ringjin listened intently to see if they could understand what these voices were saying, but it was all in a different tongue. Down, Toby ordered, and he pushed Ringjin to the rocky ground. He lowered himself flat on his belly as well and whispered, What do you want to do, Ringjin? I will crawl closer so I can see what's happening, but you may stay here if you prefer. No way, Ringjin shot back. I may be scared, but I am no coward. What's more, I am probably safer with you than without you. Toby chuckled. Let's go then, my friend. Stealthily, they crawled over the stony ground up the hill. They kept close to the ground and were hidden out of sight by the high grass and an occasional bush. At last they reached the top of the hill. Toby slid a bit further and lifted his head so he could have a better view. There, some 100 yards down in a little valley, he saw a group of warriors. They were roasting a pig and were drinking ale. Toby concluded with satisfaction that these strange warriors already had way more ale than was good for them, as they were loud and incoherent in their movements. Some of them were dressed in coats of armor that he had never seen, and their hairstyle was wild and savage. Toby turned back to Ringjin. Vikings. Ringjin crawled forward and looked over the hill. Vikings, he confirmed. A few 100 yards to the right were the burning and smoking remains of a farm. Toby pointed to it with his eyes and whispered, McDungus Farm. Ringjin nodded again. They probably killed them all. But Toby shook his head and said in as low a voice as possible, Not all. Look over there. Ringjin turned his eyes in the direction in which Toby was staring. There he spotted what appeared to be prisoners. He squinted his eyes to take a better look. Women, he said. They have captured 3 women. They are probably the daughters of McDungus, and they will most certainly abuse them. Toby's nostrils flared up and he started to breathe more heavily. Cowards, he mumbled under his breath. I want to help these women. Ringjin poked Toby's rib with his elbow. Don't, Toby, there are 10 of these Vikings. Even if they are drunk, you can't beat them all. I can't let them prey on women, Ringjin. I've got to do something. At least wait until it is dark, Ringjin pleaded. Well spoken, my friend, Toby said. When these brutes are sleeping, I will go down there and help these women. There's a boat too, Ringjin pointed further down to the right. It's a fishing boat. If we could sail it, we would make it to Iona a lot quicker. You know how to sail. Of course I do, Toby answered softly, a little indignant that Ringjin apparently had so little confidence in his abilities. However, it seems like a pretty big boat. I am not sure the 2 of us can handle it. He studied the boat for a while and then whispered, I don't think it is a Viking ship, but I see some Vikings in it. Ringjin pursed his lips. So you really want to do this? It looks like a dangerous mission. Of course I do, Toby glared at Ringjin. What kind of man do you think I am? Just asking, Ringjin said with a sigh. In that case, we better call on the god of Columba. We can sure use his help. I have never seriously asked for his help, Toby admitted, but there's no harm in doing it. Maybe we can ask him to make the night as dark as pitch so we won't be spotted. Chapter 6. The raid on the farm had been as easy for the Vikings as killing a fly. They had attacked furiously and fast and faced no serious opposition. There had only been a few terrified servants, 2 of whom Sigrundis had slain personally, and a grumpy old man who had been yelling at them. 3 other servants had run off screaming in fright, while the other Viking warriors were laughing and had been throwing curses their way. The old man had more courage and actually tried to fight Sigrundis. But he was no match for the seasoned warrior, and without any effort Sigrundis had killed the man. Right then, 2 young women ran up. They had been hiding, but when they saw the old man dying, they ran out. One of them started to beat Sigrundis in the face with her fists, but Sigrundis grabbed her by the wrist and held her at bay. The other was crying and knelt down by the old man and kissed his pale, bearded face. When Hager came in, the fighting was already over. Almost too easy, Sigrundis complained. I was hoping for more of a struggle. Hager shrugged. I am glad it was easy. We are hungry, tired, and weak. We are not in very good shape, so let's thank Odin we got off easy. We've got more pretty ones, Sigrundis said as he held the struggling young woman in his iron grip and pointed with his head to the other girl who was still weeping and kissing the old man. That was probably their father, Hager said as he looked at the motionless body of the old man. He pulled a chair away from the table and sank down on it. What do you want to do with these 2? Hager asked. Sigrundis thought for a while. Then he said with a determined face, we'll take Em along. We can always sell them for good money. And if not, I can think of some other uses for them. He licked his lips and chuckled. Hager raised his shoulders. I hope you know what you're doing, Sigrundis. We've already got your so-called Kona, and now 2 more. Sigrundis laughed. You know what your problem is, Hager? You've got no vision. I am sure glad you are not the leader of our clan. Thank you, Hager shot back as he glared back at Sigrundis. And I am glad you are not the leader of our clan either. Another Viking warrior stepped in and announced they had found lots of ale and food. We've started to carry it out, he said. The boat needs a few minor repairs, but nothing that we cannot fix. We are already working on it, but we may have to spend the night here on the beach. Then, tomorrow morning we may be able to sail. Good, Sigrundis said. Then let's burn this place to the ground. Toby did what Ringjin suggested. He called upon God. Upon the god of Columba, Toby thought with a smile. But whatever name he used, it was the same god, and it was worth a try. Besides, there was nothing else to do since he had to wait for the darkness. He remembered a prayer he had learned from his father, who had learned it from Taherlach. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed by thy name. Thy kingdom come. God's kingdom? What would that be like? Toby could not imagine it was anything like the kingdoms of this world. This earth was full of violence and injustice, and truth be told, he himself had killed quite a few men as well. How did God look at that? Would he even be allowed in God's kingdom when it came? And when would that be? Certainly those horrible Vikings would have no part in it. Or would they? Was he really that much better than they? He shook his head in frustration. Maybe praying wasn't such a good idea after all. It confused him, and confusion made a man weak. If he was back at Gilbane's, he would ask Taherlach about these things. If I make it back. A raindrop fell on his hand. Rain. Toby lifted his head slightly and peered at the clouds. The sky had grown overcast and it started to drizzle. Toby grunted. It was going to be a long, cold night. He noticed MacDunga's farm was still smouldering, but the rain would put a stop to that soon. Even though life had never been more confusing for Toby, still, he felt a deep sense of peace. Somehow, everything would work out. Strange that he would be at peace even though he had no clue as to how to solve his predicament. Where did that gentle feeling come from? God? Toby shook his head. No, that couldn't be. He focused his attention again to the Vikings in the valley below. They did not seem in a hurry to leave, and Toby guessed they were planning to leave in the morning. They had been partying and drinking and were in no state to sail. Dusk was really setting in now. It was difficult to still see the 3 women, but Toby had made a mental picture of the very place where they were sitting. He felt certain he could find it without any difficulty. The Vikings made a fire and seemed to be settling down. They were not nearly as loud anymore. The ale had tired their senses, and Toby figured they would soon go to sleep. Were there any guards? Surely they would not be so careless as to not put up a watchman. He and Ringjin had counted 10 warriors before. Toby counted them again. Still 10. That meant there were no guards. They apparently felt confident that nobody would attack them. In that case, it would be easy to liberate the prisoners. One Viking in particular caught Toby's attention. He seemed especially wild. The man dragged his bulky, hairy body around in an arrogant manner and constantly barked out orders or yelled to the others. A formidable battle axe was slung over his shoulders. When it was still light, Toby had noticed that this brute took a special interest in the captured women. He constantly walked over there as if he was checking on them. Toby was not easily frightened, but he realized that this man was an enemy to reckon with. Ringjin touched his leg. "It's almost totally dark. What's your plan?" he whispered. Toby turned and looked into the trusting blue eyes of his new friend. Although he had only just met Ringjin, he already started to develop a fondness for this lanky Scotsman. Ringjin was clearly not a warrior and even admitted he was afraid. Still, he stayed nearby, determined to be of help and willing to see Toby through in this most remarkable adventure. Ringjin was an admirable person, and with a bit of proper training, this young man would be a real help to any clan leader. The plan Toby repeated. "You stay here, I go there." Ringjin raised his eyebrows. "Listen," Toby clarified, "the less people, the less noise. Besides, I am a warrior and I can defend myself if need be. There's no need to put you in danger. After I come back, we'll decide on our next move." "You mean, if we take the boat or not?" "Right. When will you go?" Ringjin wanted to know. "Soon," Ringjin Toby stated flatly. "We will wait until they all lie around the fire and sleep. I don't want any of them to see me, especially not that one husky fellow." Ringjin nodded but didn't say anything. Toby turned his eyes again to the valley below. 8 Vikings were lying down now. 2 were still talking. One of them was the big, husky fellow. It seemed he was arguing with the other one. He was lifting his hands in the air and shouted some words that Toby did not understand. Were they having a quarrel? "Come on, boys, go to sleep. It's bedtime." Finally, the big, husky one settled down and curled up like a ball near the fire. The other fellow disappeared into the dark. Where was he going? Maybe they did have a guard. Toby whispered one of those words again that Skye would not have approved of. But then, to his relief, the Viking came back to the fire and also lay down. Thank you, God of Columba. Soon he would sneak into the camp and rescue those women. When Toby finally made his move, it had stopped raining. While he descended the hill, he kept his eyes glued on the fire and the Viking warriors around it. Toby knew the enemy was trained and their senses were well developed. Any unusual sound would alert them, and he would be in trouble. He spotted a big boulder that stood in the ground like a sentry, and he hid behind it so he could relax for a moment. Up where he came from, it was pitch dark. He knew Ringjin was there somewhere looking at the whole scene, and it gave him a strange sense of comfort to know someone was looking at him. Was God looking at him too? "Come on, Toby, this is not the time or the place for such thoughts." He left his hiding place and scanned the immediate surroundings. He needed to be careful for unexpected holes in the ground. Every step had to be the right one. Was his sword still in the right place? His fingers felt around by his side, and he was relieved when he felt his trusted blade. He was almost down. The Vikings were close now, not more than 5 yards at the most, and Toby could hear them snoring. The ale had done its job. Still, he couldn't take any risk. He moved in a circle and made sure he stayed away from the light. If he would move just a bit further down, he would get to the place where the women were being held. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream penetrated the stillness of the night. Toby froze in his steps. What happened? The big, husky Viking sat up and wiped his brow. Several others jumped to their feet and ran up to him. Toby could see him clearly now. His eyes were dark, but he seemed confused. Did he have a nightmare? "Hey Tadan Koma Dogvar Tears Idala Fala," one of them asked him. The man shook his head in anger and waved them away with his hand. Then, the big one got up and Toby's heart skipped a beat. It looked as if he was looking straight at him, and he began to walk in Toby's direction. Toby's hand went to his sword, ready to draw it at a moment's notice. Toby was certain the man had seen him. Would he attack? All Toby's senses were on the alert. His fingers tingled and he prepared himself for battle. Then, the Viking warrior took a turn to the left and walked in the direction of the prisoners, and soon the darkness swallowed him up. Toby let out a sigh of relief and wiped the sweat from his forehead. That was a close call. Instinctively, he drew back further away from the fire and squatted down. He had to wait here. There was nothing else to do. Vigor. Garbad mar osanh vita ori. Toby ducked even closer to the ground. From somewhere close by came the voice of the husky Viking. He was talking to the prisoners. Toby realized he was very close to both the Viking and the prisoners. "Get away from me, you brute." A woman's voice was answering. It sounded familiar, almost like the voice of Skye. Now the Viking warrior was laughing. Toby could hear his footsteps. He was coming back again. Toby pushed himself to the ground and made himself as small as he could. There was the warrior again. He walked right by Toby and sat down by the fire once more. Several others were looking at him. Bruni, he said. Bruni Aswina. The others relaxed and laid down again. The brute still glanced in Toby's direction one more time, but then curled up in a ball again himself and went back to sleep. Peace was restored. But Toby's senses were on the alert. That voice, that woman's voice, it sounded so familiar. Could it be that Skye was here? Chapter 7. Waiting had never seemed so long to Toby. He wanted to jump up and run to the prisoners. The more he thought about it, the more certain he was that the voice he had heard belonged to Skye. But he couldn't run. He had to wait. 10 skilled Viking warriors, even though they had been feasting on MacChonaill, were too much for him. He had to be wise and play it safe. After some time, he finally heard the comforting sound again of snoring Vikings. Not all of them, but at least most of them were sound asleep again. Just a while longer and he would make his move. He kept staring at the bulky body of the husky Viking. It was harder to see now as the fire was dying and the Vikings had not put more wood on it. Just a little while longer. At last, Toby made his move. He got up again. His body was stiff, but he didn't care. He had memorized the exact place where the Viking had disappeared into the dark and followed the same route. After only 10 steps, he heard sniffing. A girl was softly crying. "Oh God, don't let these girls scream in fright when I approach." "Don't cry. I come to rescue you," Toby whispered. "Please don't make a sound." The sniffing stopped. "Over here," another voice whispered. The voice was tense and strained. Toby moved forward. There were the women. Toby looked into the face of a frightened young woman. She was badly bruised and her long hair was matted and tangled up. Tied down next to her was a slightly older woman. She too had the same fearful expression. A big gash on her forehead told a tale of cruelty, and she started to cry as she saw Toby. "Shh, shh, please. Don't cry and don't make a sound," Toby whispered as he looked back at the fire. The Vikings still seemed to be asleep, but where was the third prisoner? Toby looked around. Then he spotted her. A few yards away from the others was the third woman, tied to a tree stump. "But Skye," Toby said, as softly as he could. For a moment there was not a sound. Then a trembling voice asked, "Toby, is that you?" Toby's heart leapt for joy. It was Skye. He had found her. "Oh, gracious God of Columba, blessed be your name." For a moment he forgot where he was and ran over to her. When he saw Skye's bruised body and her ripped clothes, tears sprung in his eyes. He knelt and kissed her face. "Oh, Skye, I have been looking all over for you." For a moment Skye didn't seem to understand what was happening. "Toby, where do you come from?" Toby couldn't help but smile. "I've come to take you home, Skye." The word home shot Skye back to reality and she jerked up. "Hurry, Toby. Hurry," Skye whispered. "We can kiss later. Get us out of here." Toby unsheathed his sword and started to cut through the ropes around Skye's hands and feet, and a moment later she was free. She got up with great difficulty and began to rub her wrists as she pointed with her head to the other two women. "The others, Toby. Set them free too." Toby moved as in a dream and walked up to the other women and cut their ropes too. "Now what?" "Follow me," Toby said as he grabbed Skye's hand. "Make no sound." He pointed to the top of the hill. "That's where we will go. I've got a friend there. Soon we'll be safe." The two other women started to run. Toby still tried to stop them. "Don't run," he whispered. "It will wake up the Vikings," but they didn't hear Toby. They were panic-stricken and only wanted to get away from these horrible Vikings. "Oh no," Toby sighed. "They will wake up the camp." It was true. No sooner had the two women started to run than the Vikings woke up. One of them yelled in a hoarse voice, "Ask veit ik standa, heiter Yggdrasil." The others grabbed their swords. This whole operation was about to go sour. "Come on, Skye," Toby shouted. "Run." Just as Toby started to run, the husky, brutish Viking warrior stepped out of the darkness and was swinging his battle axe. In spite of the dark, Toby could see the expression of his face. He looked at Toby with such hatred that Toby thought he looked straight into the bowels of hell. Toby let go of Skye's hand and lifted his sword in defense. "Run, Skye. Run," Toby yelled as he faced the Viking. "Vi eska stan more vigor," the brute shouted. "Vigor is mine." But Toby shook his head. "Sorry, you uncivilized heathen from the underworld," he spat out. "Whatever you are saying, that woman belongs to me." From the corner of his eye, Toby saw Skye disappearing into the dark. That gave him courage. He would defend Skye with his life. The brute lifted his axe and was taking a step forward. "Come on, you coward," Toby hissed at his opponent while he watched the Viking's every move. "Vigor is mine," the Viking said again. He growled and in one swift and unexpected move he slashed at Toby. There was the axe. It came down with such force that, even though Toby was prepared, it surprised him. Toby jumped to the side just in time. The axe swung by, missing him by a hair's length. But at the same time, Toby swung his sword and hit the Viking somewhere in the back. It gave a sickening sound. The man screamed in pain and roared in anger at the same time. He staggered on his feet and seemed in a daze by the unexpected hit from Toby. "That will teach you," Toby said while panting. He raised his sword again and all became black. Something hit him hard on the head. For a moment the ground was turning as if he was on a ship in the midst of a storm. What's happening? Toby desperately fought to not lose consciousness. Then he fell. The last he remembered was the taste of mud on the ground. Hager had heard something from somewhere far away on the fringes of his consciousness, and he moaned. He wanted to stay in his dream. His wife had just told him she was pregnant. "Hager," she said, "you will have another son. Odin is good to you." His wife looked so beautiful, so kind. But what was that noise? Somebody running? The image of his wife faded into the distance and the clammy, wet surroundings of the Viking camp took its place. He woke up with a jerk, just in time to see two of the prisoners running by and disappearing in the dark. "Brothers, wake up," he screamed. "Something is wrong." Instantly the other warriors were on their feet as well. "What's wrong?" Sigrunda screamed in anger. His vigor gone, he didn't wait for an answer and ran to the spot where he had tied down his prospective Kona. Hager followed in his footsteps. What they saw infuriated Sigrundas, and the warrior roared in anger. There stood Vigor, and she was no longer bound, but standing before her was a Scottish warrior. His jaws were set and he was holding a sword. "Get away from that woman," Sigrundas shouted. "Vigor is mine." The warrior glared at him and said something back. Hager figured they were no flattering words and saw how Vigor ran away into the night. Sigrundas got a hold of his battle axe. "Vigor is mine," he hissed again through gritted teeth. Then he swung his axe in one swift movement. Normally Sigrundas never missed his target, but this time he did. Hager gasped. Maybe Sigrundas missed because he was still groggy from the ale he had drunk only hours earlier, or maybe that Scottish warrior was a very skilled warrior. The man saw his chance and swung his sword in retaliation and hit Sigrundas in the back. Hager froze. Sigrundas was hit. They needed Sigrundas' strength to get them safely back home. Hager whispered a prayer to Hlyn and then ran up to the Scotsman himself. Sigrundas needed his help before he would be killed. Hager grabbed the nearest stone he could find and hit the young warrior on the head. The fellow let out a sigh, staggered around, and then fell to the ground with a loud thud. Sigrundas was moaning and blood was oozing from his back. Hager knelt down by Sigrundas. It was too dark to examine the wound, but it was clear Sigrundas was in pain. "It's going to be fine," Hager tried to encourage him. "It's probably only a flesh wound. Nothing to worry about." Sigrundas cursed and asked with difficulty, "Did you kill that imposter?" "I knocked him out. He's no longer a threat." That thought seemed to give Sigrundas some comfort. "Good, we'll deal with him later. And where is Vigor?" Hager shook his head. "I warned you, Sigrundas. She's a curse from Loki," but he could not finish his sentence as two Viking warriors stepped forward and were holding Skye in an iron grip. "We caught her while she was running up the hill," one of them reported. He grinned. "But she was no match for us." "And the other two?" Hager asked. The warrior scratched his hairy scalp. "Gone. It's too dark just now." For a moment Sigrundas forgot his pain as he looked up at Skye, and with great difficulty he mumbled, "Don't you ever run away from me again." Vigor, he stopped to catch his breath, and then added, "I will hunt you down to the gates of the underworld." But Vigor didn't understand. She was concerned about another matter. She opened her mouth and spoke in an urgent, desperate voice while she looked around. "What is she saying?" Sigrundas whispered, as he felt the pain of his wound again. "Don't know," Hager answered. "She's probably looking for that young warrior." "Ah," Sigrundas sighed. "But she won't see much of him anymore. I'll finish him off tomorrow." After he said the words, he dropped his head on his chest. He had lost consciousness. For the longest time Ringjin did not see anything unusual as he kept staring over the top of the hill. He suspected that was good news. Whatever Toby was doing, the Vikings had not spotted him. He dozed off a few times and chided himself for being so disloyal, but every time when he woke up, everything seemed calm. Then, at one point, that big Viking warrior screamed. Ringjin's heart pounded. "Good God of Columba! Keep Toby safe." But nothing much happened. Apparently the man had a nightmare, as moments later all was peaceful again. Ringjin wished he had the eyes of a cat. Where was Toby? Somewhere down there in that sea of darkness, his friend was trying to save lives. But he had no cat eyes. In fact, his eyesight was very bad, and his friends at home had often laughed at him, half on behalf of his poor eyesight. He jerked awake. There was screaming and feet were running. "Idiot. I fell asleep again. Ringjin looked over the top of the hill. The fire was almost out now, but the Vikings were running around and were screaming. Somebody was coming up the hill. It must be Toby. I am here, Toby, this way. I am here, Ringjin started to whisper as loud as he dared to do. Over here. Toby was going to make it, but the Vikings had discovered him. They would have to run for their lives. But the feet he heard did not belong to Toby. They were the feet of a woman, and before Ringjin realized what happened, a woman stepped out of the darkness. And then another one. Ringjin stared at them for a moment. They looked awful. Their faces were full of fear and their clothes were ripped. One of them was crying hysterically. The prisoners. Toby freed them. Ringjin jumped to his feet. Quiet, he ordered the crying girl with an authority he didn't even know he possessed. Keep still. Please still. Please, the woman stared at him. Her shoulders were still shaking, but she calmed down as she heard her familiar Scottish tongue. Where's Toby? Ringjin asked the other woman. Who's Toby? The man who freed you, he added. Where is he? The woman shook her head. He's fighting with the Vikings. Please. Please. Take us away from here. And leave Toby alone? No way, Ringjin said. He heard more screams in the camp and he turned his view to the fire again. What he saw was greatly unsettling. Some Vikings were pulling a body over the ground and tied him to a stone. He squinted to see better. Was that Toby? Is that the man who freed you? He asked the eldest of the two women. The woman nodded and then pulled the other woman by the hand and started to run again. The last one started to cry once more as they disappeared into the night, and soon he could not hear them anymore. Oh, God of Columba, they caught Toby. He stared at the scene before him and sank to the ground. He saw how the Vikings dragged another woman around. That must be the other prisoner. Oh God, what must I do now? They had caught Toby. All was now lost. Chapter 8. When Toby woke up, his head was pounding. His tongue felt swollen and everything in his body screamed for water. He licked his parched lips. They were salty. Where was he anyway? He wanted to rub his head with his hand, but he couldn't. Something was holding his hands down, and why was everything swaying so much? Toby tried to remember what had happened, but he couldn't think clearly. Somewhere above him, he heard the lonely cry of a seagull. A seagull. When he opened his eyes, the surroundings appeared foggy and out of focus. Concentrate, Toby. He squinted his eyes and looked again. A boat. He was on a boat. In the distance, he saw nothing but the vast waters of the sea, and he was tied to the mast. A warrior was standing a few yards away and was holding the steering bar and peered over the waters. Vikings. Now, Toby remembered. He remembered how he freed the prisoners, and one of these prisoners had been Skye. He had found her again, but then he ran into that brutish Viking. He saw that ugly man with his battle axe again in his mind's eye. But had he not delivered a terrible blow to the wretch with his sword? Why then was he here? The last he remembered was seeing Skye running away, and then everything became blurry. At least Skye had gotten away. That thought comforted him considerably. Things could be worse. As Toby looked around at the ship, he remembered the fishing boat that he and Ringjin wanted to steal. This was that same boat, and the Vikings were taking him with them. I need water. Water, please. Toby called out to the Viking with a broken voice. The man turned around and faced Toby. He had long blonde hair and eyed Toby suspiciously with his dark blue eyes. Menir near Fengu, Bime Skip. Toby pressed his lips together and tried to mimic drinking. The Viking nodded and a small smile appeared on his face. Asdura for Heim, he said and shrugged. Then he walked over to a barrel, picked up a ladle that was lying beside it and stuck it inside. After he pulled it out, he held it before Toby's face and allowed Toby to drink. It was not very fresh, but to Toby it tasted like the best ale he had ever had, and he gulped it down. When he was done, he looked up into the face of the Viking. Thank you, he whispered. The Viking nodded and threw the ladle back on the deck. He looked for a moment into Toby's eyes. Then he turned and took his position again at the oar. What now? Toby looked up and noticed the sun was still rising. It was fairly early then, but already it was getting hot. How long would they let him stay like this? Being tied down to a mast of a fishing boat certainly wasn't the most comfortable place he had ever been in. Every part of his body seemed to hurt. Should he call on God for help again? Praying hadn't really helped, although. He did find Skye, although now she was gone again. Or did the Vikings still catch her? Toby imagined how Skye met Ringjin up on the hill. Would he bring her to Iona? Again, he lifted his heart to God. God of Columba, help me please. If you are really there, then please come to my rescue. Toby woke with a shock. His body was hurting even more now. If only he could stretch his legs or massage his wrists. But that was impossible. Big drops of sweat had formed on his forehead, and he tried to shake them off with a nod. Several Vikings were on deck now and were pointing to the sea in alarm. Why did they do that? Toby looked up and tried to see if he could see what the Vikings saw. There, a few hundred yards away, a heavy, thick mist seemed to roll over the waves and was fast approaching. Toby's eyes widened. Being a Scotsman, he was well acquainted with low-hanging mists on the moor, but never before had he seen such a thick fog moving so speedily and in such an unusual fashion. The Vikings clearly had never seen such a thing either and were calling on their gods. Toby couldn't help but smile. So much for the courage of these Vikings. They were afraid of a mere fog, but he had to admit this mist was rather unusual. It almost looked as if a team of invisible horses was pulling the mist along, and soon it would reach them and cover them completely. The Viking that had given Toby a drink hours earlier was still holding the steering bar and seemed unmoved. If he was afraid, at least he didn't show it. That man stared into the approaching fog with a grim expression while his blonde hair was flapping in the wind. Toby's mind was working fast now as he realized this fog could provide him with a way of escape. But how could he free himself? The mist was real close now. Toby could already feel the clammy, cold atmosphere approaching. Then the boat slipped into the mist and covered them all. It was so heavy that Toby could no longer even see the Viking at the steering bar. It seemed the wind died down too as the fishing boat stopped rocking and reeling, and other than the water that was sloshing against the hull of the boat, hardly a sound was heard. The Vikings had stopped calling out to their gods, and Toby figured they were watching in awe. The mist was humid and cold, and Toby shivered. He desperately pulled on the ropes again, even though he knew it was no use. A Viking warrior appeared out of the mist and walked past. Toby had never seen him before, but the man took no interest in him, and just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone again into the mist. Oh God, please help. Toby sighed. But praying was no use in this situation. Not even God could free him. He heard a sound behind him, as if somebody was crawling. Toby, I'm here. Don't talk. Ha! Somebody whispered words to him and something touched his arm. Toby stiffened. Was he imagining things? He turned his head to the side to see what it was, but he couldn't quite reach far enough. Then that same voice whispered again into his ear. It sounded familiar. Don't make a sound, Toby. We need to move quickly. Ringjin? Is that you? Shh, please don't talk. Toby's heart leapt for joy. Ringjin was there. How did you? Quiet, please. Now Toby could turn his head far enough to see his young friend. He was holding a knife and started to cut through the ropes. Oh, thank you, God. Soon Toby's hands were free and he started to rub them vigorously. Ringjin started to cut through the ropes that bound his feet to the mast. What are we going to? Toby started to ask, but he couldn't finish his sentence. Right when Ringjin was about to cut the last of the ropes, an unearthly shaft of light pierced through the fog out of nowhere and illuminated the mist in a strange, yet wonderful way. The mist sparkled and shone and all became very still. For a moment, not a sound was heard. Then the Vikings broke out in fearful screams and yells, and only a moment later there was a thunderous, deafening crack that made the boat shudder and threw Ringjin onto the deck. Everywhere around them wood was splintering. The boat was reeling forward and the mast to which Toby was still partly tied was cracking and swaying. Magic, Ringjin screamed while he was rolling over the deck. It's dark magic. Cut the rope. Cut the rest of the rope, Toby yelled as he too was tumbling over and landed forward on the deck with a heavy thud. Out of the corner of his eye, he could still see that Ringjin was sliding into the Viking warrior that he had seen only moments earlier. Then both Ringjin and the Viking disappeared in the thick fog. The shaft of light was still there. It made that strange and yet familiar sizzling sound that Toby had heard before, and he yelped. This had something to do with the strange disappearance of Skye and the wives of his brothers and his flying through time. Then, just as quickly as the light had appeared, it faded away. But the ship was badly damaged. It had crashed somehow. There were more screams. Somebody was yelling in a strange tongue, but Toby couldn't see where it came from. The mist was still too thick. His heart started to race as he felt the ship was now tilting in a strange upward position. They were going to sink. If he didn't free himself soon, he was going to drown. He yanked and pulled, but the rope didn't break. Cold, salty seawater surrounded his head. While his feet were up and tied to the mast, his head was already in the water. Another crack. The mast. In horror, Toby stared as he saw the mast was breaking. It was bending forward and cracking more and more. In just a few seconds, it would snap like a twig in a storm, and it would crush him. Oh God. Save me ... I won, but Toby couldn't finish his desperate cry for help. Everything became black, and for the second time in a day, Toby lost consciousness. Oh God, save me, I want... But Toby couldn't finish his desperate cry for help. Everything became black, and for the second time in a day, Toby lost consciousness. Chapter 9. Toby. Wake up, Toby. From somewhere far away, Toby heard somebody calling his name. He needed to answer. He needed to wake up. He was on a mission to find Skye, but he was captured by these horrible Vikings. Vikings. Get away from me, Toby yelled, and he swung his fist in the air. Oh! Ho! Calm down, Toby. Who is calling me, Skye? Is that you? No, Toby, I am not Skye. I am Ringjin. Ringjin. Toby lifted up his head and jerked it back again. Water. Wherever he looked, he saw water. He was surrounded by water on the left, on the right, before him and behind him. The fog had lifted and a pale sun was shining on the waters. Ringjin was sitting nearby and motioned with his hand that all was well. You are safe, Toby. We've made it. Where are we? Toby gasped. Then he realized he was sitting in a puddle of seawater. As if stung by a wasp, he yanked up his hand and stared down in horror. Ringjin put his hand on his shoulder. Careful, Toby, he warned. If you move too much, we may fall in again. Then Toby saw it. They were floating on a board that had broken off the fishing boat and were peacefully bobbing along on the ocean. What happened? Ringjin shrugged his shoulders. Don't really know, Toby, he sighed. I was just about to free you in the thick mist when that strange light hit the boat. That light must have demolished it. But I was tied to the mast. How did I get here? Toby wanted to know. Something must have fallen on your head, Ringjin said. When the ship went down, I saw you being pulled under, but I dove after you and cut the rope with my knife. He grinned and showed Toby his knife. It's a pretty good knife. Got it from my father some years ago? The blade sparkled in the sunlight. Toby looked at it and pushed back a lump that formed in his throat. Thanks, Ringjin. You are a true friend. Ringjin shrugged his shoulders. When I came back up to the surface and was dragging you with me, I saw this board floating by. It's not a very comfortable place, but I suppose it's better than nothing. Toby nodded. But tell me, how did you get on the ship and what did you do with Skye after I sent her to you? Skye, Ringjin answered with a puzzled look. Was she one of the two women I saw up there? Toby stared at him. No, she was the third one. Ringjin pursed his lips. I only saw two women. They ran on. They did not want to stop. Since they were panic-stricken, he looked at Toby and his eyes got a gentle expression. But when I looked down at the Viking camp, I saw they had captured you. They were dragging you around. And since they were tying you up, I figured you were still alive and you could use some help beside. I climbed down the hill and snuck onto the fishing boat. I figured the Vikings would leave early, so I hid behind some barrels. A sudden coldness hit Toby. But, Skye, you never saw her. Ringjin thought for a moment. Well, I don't know what Skye looks like, but I did see the third prisoner still. You did. Toby made such a sudden move that the board was pushed underwater and both men were being engulfed. Ho, Toby. I told you to be careful, Ringjin cried out when the board had somewhat stabilized back into its floating position. We didn't come this far to drown. Sorry, Toby mumbled, but tell me about the third prisoner. Well, Ringjin continued, she was tied as well, and they were herding her along too. I think she must have been on the fishing boat as well. Toby moaned. Oh no. What? Toby did not answer right away. Finally, he spoke in somber tones. If she was on the boat too, she must have drowned. You see, that third prisoner was Skye. Toby felt emotions cropping up he had never experienced before. Dark, cold voices and sentiments of failure and gloom were now competing for the stage of his mind, and he hung his head low. Are you sure that third woman was Skye? Ringjin asked. Toby nodded. Of course, I am sure. For a long time he stared at the waters around him. Finally he mumbled, I freed her and told her to run up the hill. But then I got into a fight with the Vikings and... You don't know she's dead, Toby. The god of Columba is on our side. He wouldn't let us get this far just so we could end up in defeat. But Toby shook his head. No, my friend. This time it's over for good. We may as well die ourselves. Stop it, Toby, Ringjin scolded. You can't say these things. And what's more, his voice trailed off. While he peered into the distance, there's another boat over there. A boat? Toby looked into the direction in which Ringjin was pointing. What kind of boat? Ringjin was right. There, a few hundred yards away, was a small vessel. Its single, square sail was billowing in the breeze, and they could see the forms of some human beings. You think they are Vikings? Ringjin clearly had enough of Vikings. Toby let his gaze wander. What does it matter? We are as good as dead, and I don't care. Ringjin did not pay any attention to Toby's outburst of discouragement and kept on staring at the boat. It's not a Viking boat, he said more to himself than to Toby. Neither was the boat we were just on, Toby spoke with a voice that could have come out of the grave. But Ringjin refused to sit in the dumps with Toby and started to wave and yell, over here, over here, over here. Then he turned to Toby. Come on, Toby, my friend. Eadard said that the god of Columba always has a plan. And, what's more, I don't think they are Vikings on that boat. Ringjin kept on waving and yelling, and at one point he started to jump. I think they have spotted us. They are coming this way. Careful, Toby yelled, but he was too late and he disappeared into the water when Ringjin took a second jump. When he came up again, he was still clutching the board and was spitting out water. Sorry, Ringjin said as he turned and saw the fearful look on Toby's face. But soon we are safe, Toby, soon we are safe. The small sailing vessel that spotted them approached fast. Ringjin kept his eyes glued on the advancing vessel. Toby too had now taken an interest in the boat. Who knows, maybe Ringjin was right and the god of Columba was not yet finished with them. He crawled to Ringjin and was careful not to make too many sudden movements and placed his right hand above his forehead in order to get a better view. All things appeared to be peaceful. But when the vessel came close, he froze. There, in the boat, beside a few figures he couldn't place, he spotted two people he could place. They are Vikings, he sighed, and he dropped his head in discouragement. And it was true. Ringjin saw it too now. There in the boat were Vikings. Toby spotted the man who had given him some water. He wasn't too bad, although he still wouldn't trust that man for anything. But the other Viking was bad. Toby would recognize the man anywhere. For there, in the back of the boat, sat the husky Viking warrior that he had fought with, and that he had wounded with his sword. An enormous dirty bandage was tied around him. He was still alive, although Toby noticed with some sense of relief that the man did not seem to be in any condition to fight. However, there were Vikings on that boat and they most certainly would not deal kindly with them. It's over, Ringjin, he sighed. They are going to kill us for sure this time. There's a few other folk in the boat too, Ringjin said. You know them. Toby studied the other ones. Even though the boat was getting closer and closer, it was hard to clearly discern their faces. One of them appeared to be some sort of monk. The other one had his face hidden by a cloak. Maybe he was a monk too, and finally he noticed a burly, strong-muscled man who appeared to be in charge of the sailboat. Two are monks, Toby said. But I don't know them. The other one is just sailing the boat. What's a monk, Ringjin wanted to know. You know, a monk. A servant of the god of Columba. Ringjin's face lit up. A servant of the god of Columba. Then we must be safe, Toby. Toby shook his head. I am afraid not, Ringjin. Prepare for the worst. The boat was getting close now, and they all could clearly see each other. Toby noticed how the big, husky warrior was scowling. He was clearly not happy. That didn't look good, but the monk or whoever he was seemed happy and was waving at them. Why is he happy? Doesn't he realize he's in trouble with the Vikings? What's wrong with him? Then the monk cupped his hands and shouted something. The sound carried far over the waters, and both Ringjin and Toby could clearly hear him. Toby MacChonaill, is that you? I have come to bring you glad tidings. Ringjin stared at Toby. That fellow knows you. Toby scratched his head. I don't understand. As the boat came closer, Toby's muscles tensed and he searched for his sword, but it wasn't by his side anymore. Watch out, Ringjin. It's a trap. Let's not go down without a fight. Chapter 10. Toby was surprised nobody jumped on them when the two boats were within reach of each other. He had expected an attack of the Viking warriors, but both men stayed in the boat. Toby stared at the big, ugly fellow. The man glared back with obvious disdain. Clearly, the man wasn't in a good mood. Toby MacChonaill, the monk spoke from his boat. If you would know the lengths I had to go through to find you. But here you are, he smiled a grand smile, and Toby's eyes widened while his skin tingled. Who was this man? The monk was dressed in a white cloak that covered his body, but now that Toby could take a better look, he saw the man was wearing a leather breastplate under his cloak. A shining, silvery sword dangled at his belt. For a warrior monk, I need to watch out. At first, the monk had his hood pulled over his head, but now that he was talking to Toby, he pulled it down, revealing his long white hair that matched the color of his long beard. His friendly green eyes were smiling at Toby. Still, Toby kept his distance. How do you know my name? Where do you come from? And why are you in a boat with my enemies? The monk grinned. Not so fast, Toby MacChonaill. He raised his hand and motioned for Toby to listen. One question at a time, please. He pointed at some empty spots in the sailing vessel, and while he raised his white eyebrows, he asked, but wouldn't you and your friend be a bit more comfortable in the boat? Floating around on a board in the ocean hardly seems the place for a good conversation. But Toby shook his head. We are fine here. Sure, the monk answered. As to answer your question as to where I came from, maybe you should phrase your question a bit differently. It's not from where, but from when I came. He studied Toby's face for a while. From when? Toby felt his heart started to beat a little faster. The monk nodded. Yes, Toby, from when? My name is Colbardus and I am a good friend of the respected Terlock. Terlock, Toby shouted it out. Colbardus nodded. Yes, you heard me right. I come from your time. I am well acquainted with the power of the magical stones and have devoted my life to study about them. Especially some little-known books written by St. Columba have taught me a lot about these stones. You know about the stones. Colbardus nodded and motioned with his hand for Toby to listen. Yes, I do. When Terlock told me about the mysterious disappearances in your village, I took it upon myself to follow you and get you back to your own time. Thank God, Toby whispered. But how does that all work? Colbardus chuckled. Well, I will spare you the technical details, but my knowledge of the magical stones allows me to pretty much land anywhere in time. It has a lot to do with coordinates, time zones, and whatnot. But when the stars are in the right place, I can land pretty much anywhere. Since I was searching for you, I landed right near you. Except I do not yet seem to be very familiar with the impact my arrival has on the surroundings. In this case, I am afraid I pretty much destroyed the fishing boat and landed everyone in the water. It's magic, Ringjin blurted out. Dark magic. He looked in awe at Toby and then stuttered, so it's all true. You really are from another time. But Toby didn't listen to him and pointed to the Viking warriors. But why are you in a boat with these horrible fellows? He motioned with his head in the direction of the husky warrior. That man tried to kill me and stole my wife. Colbardus nodded. I know, he stated simply. Then he placed his hand on the shoulder of the other Viking and said, But this man saved your wife. Huh? What do you mean? The Viking warrior looked up for a moment and locked eyes with Toby's. I will tell you all about it, Toby the monk continued. I found this man in the water. His name is Hager, by the way. He was struggling to save several people, but it was a hopeless cause since he was in the middle of the ocean. I was just in time. Colbardus pointed to the mean warrior. This was one of the ones he saved. He should have let him drown, Toby thought. But you said he saved my wife. What do you mean? A grand smile appeared on Colbardus' face as now he pointed to the hooded monk, whose face was still hidden. Hager saved this one too. He was holding onto her for dear life with one hand, trying to keep her head above the water. A fluttery feeling welled up in Toby's stomach as he stared at the hooded monk. Her. That's right, Colbardus smiled. He turned to the hooded person and asked in soft tones, Take your hood off, dear. In a swift movement, she pulled the hood away from over her head, revealing her long brown curls. Toby staggered back and almost slipped off the floating board. The woman stared at Toby with shiny, blue eyes and a big smile broke out on her face. Skye, Toby yelled. It's you. Toby, Skye answered with a choked voice. Toby yelled again and jumped off the floating board into the sailboat, causing the wood to be pushed underwater. Ringjin yelled as well, although for a different reason. He disappeared into the ocean, only to come back up moments later, dripping, coughing and spitting out water. Toby did not even notice it as he threw himself into Skye's outstretched arms and kissed her. Colbardus looked at the scene and chuckled again. Nothing is as pure as young love, he muttered. Ringjin climbed aboard as well, and Colbardus nodded to the sailor who was steering the ship. Aye, Macready, to the shore, please. Get us to the shore. We've still got more to do today. Toby glared at the Vikings. He didn't mind Hager so much. After all, Colbardus had said he had saved Skye from drowning, and the man had given him to drink when he was still a prisoner on the fishing boat. At one point, the man had even tried to make some conversation with him, and now he extended his hand to Toby. Not Ichthuanhompat Hager. Colbardus smiled. He says his name is Hager, and he wants you to know he means you no harm. You speak their tongue, Toby asked with widening eyes. Sure, Colbardus answered. But answer the man. It's not polite not to shake hands. Toby took Hager's hand and looked into the young warrior's face. Toby MacChonaill. I mean you no harm either. Thank you for saving Skye's life. Hager looked up at Colbardus, who nodded and translated for Hager. Alfur Baugur Hokur Kono Frinungur, Skye. The Viking seemed pleased and leaned back on his seat in the boat. But the other Viking was a different story. Toby didn't like the looks of him at all, and he didn't want to be near the man, not even for all the gold in the world. He wasn't sure if the tortured expression on the man's ugly face had something to do with the wound he inflicted on the warrior earlier, or if it was inspired by dark creatures of the underworld that had taken possession of the man's body. Colbardus? Yes. Tell that man I am sorry I hurt him. He should understand, though, I will lay down my life for my wife. Anyone that touches her will have to deal with me personally. Colbardus pressed his lips together and stared at the warrior. His name is Sigrundus. The warrior looked up. Sigrundus? Igor Ormin Olafar, Heiter Brandrin Turfingur. Olaf Sir Olafar Kosiger. Anger flashed over Sigrundus' face, and he clenched his fists while he glared at Toby. Vigor is mine, vigor me Kona, he answered with a growl. Colbardus shook his head. Sorry, Toby, I don't think you two will ever see eye to eye. Anyway, in a short while you'll be rid of him. Soon you and Skye will be home. Toby decided not to let the joy of finding Skye be spoiled by the ugly Sigrundus, and, while the giant scowled and glowered, he placed a loving kiss on Skye's parched lips. Vigor me Kona, Sigrundus burst out again and got up, but before anything could happen, Hager jumped up too and pushed the Viking back to his seat. Toby shook his head. Yeah, nothing Vigor me Kuna, he said. You keep away from my wife with your ugly fingers. But their arguing was stopped by the cheerful yell of McGrady, the boatsman. Aye. Land ho, there's the shore, fellows. And indeed, when Toby looked up, he saw the Scottish coast appear. Never before had Scotland seemed more beautiful to him. Soon he would be back in Gilbanes and he could really start to enjoy life as a married man. Chapter 11. When do you think we can return home, Toby? Asked the old monk, while he bit his lips. They were staying in the house of boatsman McGrady, who had generously opened his doors for them. It was a small cottage overlooking the sea, and Toby and Skye had slept for almost 24 hours straight. But now that Toby was awake, he wanted to move. He had found Skye again, his body was rested up and he was ready for action. His mission was accomplished and he did not want to stay even 1 minute longer in this strange, unfamiliar place than was absolutely necessary. Colbardus was sitting on a bench near the cottage and the old man was apparently enjoying the view. The sun was just behind a great blanket of clouds, but still cast a luminous reflection on the dark blue waters of the sea. Countless seagulls soared over the cliff nearby, and at times dropped themselves into the waters below to pick up something to eat. It was indeed a fascinating spectacle. Toby sat down next to him and repeated his question. Colbardus plucked on his beard and thought for a while. Have a little patience, my young friend. We need patience. That was not the answer Toby was hoping for. When, Colbardus? When? He leaned forward and spoke with a strained voice. The monk raised his eyebrows. You can't force the elements, young Toby. I need to make some calculations. The stars need to be in the right position, and we may possibly need to travel to another spot. Travel? Why? Toby crossed his arms. Why can't you just shoot us away? Colbardus shook his head. You may be a fine warrior, Toby MacChonaill, but you don't understand the workings of God. God, Toby gazed at Colbardus. Does he have anything to do with all this? Colbardus started laughing. Yes, Toby, there's not anything I can think of that God doesn't have something to do with. Toby frowned. I don't understand. To be honest, Colbardus, I've been thinking a lot about God lately, but I don't understand him. I don't think any mortal can really ever understand God, Colbardus answered with a faint smile. He is the timeless creator who lives outside of time, so he's not bound by time or tide. He can ride the waves of the wind like you would ride your horse. He laid the cornerstones of the earth, while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. He is the one who shut up the sea behind its mighty doors, and he gives his orders to the sun. He tells the stars and the moon what to do. He knows where the light rests at night, and he orders the darkness into its corner, like you would order a slave. Toby took a step backwards and whispered, Then he is awesome, he's so big. Colbardus nodded. He is Toby, and if there's one thing I have learned throughout the years is that God is God and we are not. Toby frowned. What does that mean? It means God has his plan. He has his time, and he wants to do things his way. You can't rush him. Like when we wanted to marry, but Terlach told us to wait, but we went ahead anyway. Colbardus looked up. Exactly, Toby. You see, God never forces us to do anything we don't like. He has given us free will. But if we follow our own ideas instead of God's, things may go sour. He picked up an apple and showed it to Toby. This apple tastes so good because it was picked when it was ripe. If I would have plucked it off the tree before it was ripe, it would have tasted awfully sour too, and I would have cast it awfully sour too, and I would have cast it aside. His eyes had a playful glance as he took a bite. There's a time for everything, Toby. The secret is to work in harmony with God's plan and His will for your life. Then you will be blessed. Toby sat down and sighed. That sounds difficult. I guess I will never learn. Colbardus placed his hand on Toby's shoulder. You will, Toby, you will. The Son of God even said that we need to believe as little children, and little children don't know much about anything. I like to believe, Colbardus. Patience, Toby, patience. God will reveal Himself to you. I believe He's already knocking on the door of your heart. Right at that moment, Ringjin rushed up while waving his arms. Toby jumped up. What is it, Ringjin? Is everything all right? Ringjin shook his head. That Sigrunda's fellow ran off. Toby shrugged his shoulders. Good riddance of bad rubbish, but I thought he was too badly wounded to go anywhere. Ringjin shook his head. Apparently he wasn't in that bad a shape. McGrady's wife helped quite a bit too. Ringjin's eyes were blinking rapidly. I am afraid we haven't seen the last of him. And Hager, Toby asked. He's still here. Good, Toby smiled. Don't worry about Sigrundas, Ringjin. I knocked him out before, remember. What's more, we'll be out of here soon. But I am not, Ringjin answered, and he was a little pale around the nose. 2 days later, Colbardus walked up to Toby and Skye with a grand smile. He was holding a small stone in his hand and showed it to them. What's that? Toby asked. The time is right, Toby. This stone is of the same material as the magical stones you have seen in Gilbane's, and the stars are in their proper position. You will travel back to our own time tomorrow. Toby's heart jumped for joy. We will? Oh, Colbardus, you are making me a happy man. He turned to Skye and gave her a big kiss. Tomorrow we can finally live as man and wife. Skye gave him a playful smile. And what have we been doing these last 2 days then? Toby nodded. Still, being home with you is all I want. I never knew I liked home so much. I suppose you never know how important something is until you don't have it anymore. I know, Colbardus chuckled. In any case, I wanted to tell you to get ready. It's time you say your goodbyes. Tomorrow you and Skye will be back in your own time. Time to say goodbye? Toby's shoulders drooped. He desperately wanted to leave this horrible time, but he did not relish giving up his friendship with Ringjin. They had only known each other for a short time, but a deep friendship had already been developed. Ringjin had even saved his life, and saying goodbye would be hard. Colbardus noticed the sad expression on Toby's face. What's wrong, Toby? You'd rather stay here? No, 1,000 times, no, Toby swallowed. Still, saying goodbye is hard. Colbardus nodded. I understand, Toby, but you are needed back home. And remember what happened the last time when you were leaning to your own understanding. I know, Colbardus, I really do. Colbardus put his bony hand on Toby's arm. Tomorrow, my friend, you will travel back to Gilbane's. Toby and Ringjin were walking along the beach. How different it was from the first time they had been walking there. How confused Toby had been at that time, and then to think that was only a few days ago. It seemed like a lifetime. Tomorrow I will be leaving, Ringjin. We are leaving tomorrow, Ringjin questioned, while his eyes grew big. No, Ringjin, Toby spoke slowly. I will be leaving. You are? Where? You know, Toby shrugged. You have heard, Colbardus. Tomorrow the stars are in the right position, and Skye and I will travel back to our own time. Ringjin stared at the sand and said nothing. You need to go back to your father, Ringjin. You need to feed his cows. His cows? Ringjin looked up with a bitter smile. I don't want to go back there. I love my father, but I do not want to spend my life feeding his cows. What I have experienced these days has opened my eyes. Life has so much more to offer. Toby swallowed. Still, you need to go back to him, Ringjin. I need to go back to my own time. Skye and I do not belong here. Ringjin coughed. I understand, Toby. He looked at the sand and didn't speak for some time. At last he looked up and asked, will you ever come back? Toby chuckled. That's a strange question. I don't know, Ringjin. I suppose it is not up to me. Ringjin stopped Toby. High above them, 2 seagulls were fighting over a piece of fish and made loud, screeching sounds. It's been an honor knowing you, Toby MacChonaill. Toby felt a lump forming in his throat. The honor is entirely mine, Ringjin, he answered. I wanted to say, but he could not finish his sentence as a sharp pain shot through his body. His leg collapsed under him, and he sank to the sand. As he stared at his leg, he froze. Blood was oozing out of his thigh, and a sharp arrow had pierced his leg. Ringjin was the first to respond and attack. Toby, we are under attack. Toby looked up, and a few hundred yards away he saw 3 men. 2 of them were running in their direction, and the other was getting ready to shoot another arrow. He was big and husky. It's Sigrundas, Toby yelled. For a moment he sat on the sand in a daze, but Ringjin yanked him up. Come on, Toby, we've got to run. I can't run, Toby said with great difficulty. My leg. It hurts too much. But Ringjin did not seem satisfied with that answer. Come on, Toby. If you don't run, you are a dead man. Toby forced himself to move. With every step, the pain became more intense. I can't go on, Ringjin. Hide, Ringjin hissed. We must hide. He looked around for a place to hide. Toby realized this would most likely be the end of the journey. On his left was the endless sea, and on the right were the high cliffs that couldn't be climbed. He could not defend himself. Sigrundus would kill him after all. There, Ringjin yelled. There's a hole. A cave, maybe. He pointed to a dark spot in the rocks behind a big boulder that indeed looked like it was the entrance to some sort of a tunnel. The blood, Toby stammered. It makes a trail. No, it won't, Ringjin said with a grim expression while he tore off his shirt. He knelt down on the sand near Toby and bound his shirt as good as he could around the wounded leg and the arrow that was still sticking out. Just to get us into that hole, he yelled. Another arrow whooshed by and hit the rock, barely missing Toby's head. They could hear the excited voices of the two running men. They were Scottish. Sigrundus must have made some sort of deal with them, Toby panted. Ringjin had tied his makeshift bandage around Toby's leg and dragged Toby onto the rocks. Come on, Toby, you want to go back to your own time alive, don't you? Toby gritted his teeth. Ringjin pulled harder and Toby yelped. There was the opening in the rocks. Indeed, it appeared to be some sort of small cave. It smelled like seawater and was damp and dark. Toby figured at times the sea would even reach this far. Come on, Toby, almost there. Ringjin pushed Toby down and started to crawl into the cave. Just as Toby disappeared into the dark, the two men appeared from behind another rock. They could now clearly hear their voices. We've got them, one of them said. There's no way out for these folks. But where, the other hissed. I don't see them. Toby wanted to scream in pain, but he forced himself to be still and crawled as well as he could to the back of the cave and prayed the darkness would cover him. He could not see Ringjin anymore as it was so dark, but he heard him panting. Oh God, Toby mumbled a prayer. This is your chance. I don't understand you, but Culbertus tells me you are knocking on my heart. Show me your power. What are you doing? Whispered Ringjin. Praying to the god of Columba, Toby whispered back. If he can't help, nobody can. Ringjin did not answer. When Toby looked out from the back of the cave, he froze. There, in the entrance of the cave, he could see the feet of one of the Scottish pursuers. Hey, Millard, the man shouted, here's a cave. They must be in here. The other man joined him. Now Toby could see 2 pairs of feet. God, please deliver us. The man called Millard kneeled down and peered into the cave. Toby could see his beard and pushed himself even further back into the cold rocky side. For a moment, Millard said nothing, but then he got up and said, Nay, they can't be in here. We've got to move quickly before they escape. Just as he said it, a 3rd pair of feet came in sight. Sigrundus. Nakfar Nukur received Tigga. Toby would have recognized that dark, hateful voice any time. What's he saying? The man called Millard asked his companion. Don't know, the other answered. In any case, even this brute will understand his enemy is not here. Come on, we must move quickly, otherwise they will get away, and we won't get our gold. 2 pairs of feet disappeared, and Toby heard the sound of running. Sigrundus still stayed. They heard him grunting, but then he too moved on. For the longest time, neither Toby nor Ringjin dared to move, but finally Toby heard Ringjin whisper. Toby. I am here. What happened? Don't know. You think the coast is clear? Toby thought for a moment. Yes, I think so. Let's go and look. With great difficulty, Toby crawled to the mouth of the cave and Ringjin followed him. The god of Columba did it, Toby, Ringjin said while he was panting. Toby nodded but could hardly concentrate. The pain in his leg was so intense that he felt like fainting. Almost there now, Toby said with great difficulty. Then he stopped and he stared. What is this? He stammered. What? Ringjin asked from behind. Look, Toby moved to the side so that Ringjin could see it too. Ringjin's mouth fell open as he stared at the same thing Toby had seen. There, in the opening of the cave, was a giant spider web, gently swaying in the wind. In the midst of the web sat a big spider waiting for flies and other insects for his evening meal. Where did that web come from? Ringjin asked. Toby shook his head. I don't know. Then it became too much for him, and the mighty warrior let his tears freely flow. It is God, Ringjin. God made a spider web to protect us. Nobody could have been in this cave without breaking the web. That's why the enemy thought we couldn't be in here. As his tears dropped onto the clammy floor of the cave, he remembered the words of Culbertus. God will reveal himself to you, Toby. I believe he's already knocking on the door of your heart. The words the old monk had spoken were true. God had revealed himself, and right then and there, Toby decided he would have to follow this God for the rest of his life. Chapter 12. That evening, Toby and Skye were standing huddled together on a grassy spot near MacGrady's cottage. Ringjin was standing on the side and was watching with a sad expression. After their adventure on the beach, he had climbed out of the cave and run back to the cottage to get help. After Colbardus had explained what had happened to Hager, Ringjin had led the strong warrior back to the cave, and together they had helped Toby to get back to Skye. MacGrady's wife had removed the arrow and treated the wound with herbs. Well, Colbardus said with a grim expression, we can't wait for your leg to be healed. It has to happen right now. We can't wait any longer. Colbardus pointed at the grassy spot. This is the right place. It's now or never. Toby was still in great pain, but he understood this was not the time to baby himself, and he had dragged himself to the appointed spot. Going back home was worth everything, and while he was holding on to Skye's hand, he said goodbye to the others. This time he did not fail to especially thank Hager, and when he looked into the blue eyes of the blonde warrior, he had even pulled the warrior close and given him a big hug. It had startled Hager, but the man understood it was the custom and did not object. You hold this stone in your hand, Colbardus said to Skye as he pushed the stone into her hands. You squeeze it tight and hold on to Toby. Don't let go of him. Skye smiled. I will never let go of him again. Colbardus nodded. Well, whatever you do, hold him tight. Aren't you coming? Colbardus, Toby asked. Colbardus shook his head. I am on a mission, my friend. I won't be coming today. Maybe someday I will tell you about it, he smiled, and then looked up into the sky. Get ready. It's about to happen. Within a few moments you'll be gone from here. I better get out of the way. He took a few steps backward and watched from a safe distance. Toby and Skye waited with bated breath. Ringjin stretched his neck to not miss even a moment of the spectacle. Hager was looking doubtful, and MacGrady and his wife just smiled. They seemed to have experienced this before. It's almost coming now, Colbardus called out again. Are you holding on to the stone? Of course I am, Skye answered. But nothing happened. Slowly the minutes passed by. Skye's hand started to hurt from holding on to the stone. She looked up at Toby. What's happening? Toby shook his shoulders. I don't know, he called out to Colbardus. Are you sure you calculated this right? Colbardus peered at the sun again and nodded. Of course I am sure, he mumbled. Then he scratched his head and gave a confused stare. This is not possible. This never happened before. I had it all figured out. He plucked on his beard again, and after a long silence he shook his head and said, It's over. The window of opportunity has passed. What? Toby yelled. What do you mean? Colbardus shrugged. I mean that it's not working. You can't travel. The stars are no longer in the proper place now. Skye let out a sob and asked in a small voice, Does that mean we will have to live here? Toby shook his head. Whatever happens, Skye, God is with us. That much I know. Right then, light flashed from the sky and grey clouds rolled in as if out of nowhere. There was the sizzling sound again. Colbardus yelped. Hager moved back in awe, and Ringjin jumped. He jumped forward and grabbed Toby's hand. I'll go with you, Toby MacChonaill. What are you doing? Toby yelled while the ground around him started to turn faster and faster and faster. I am coming with you, Ringjin said. I never had a friend like you. But before Toby could say anything or object, everything became blurry. First he heard music, bagpipes again, and there were the faces he had never seen before, and then everything became dark. If he would have been able to still hear, he would have heard Colbardus joyfully scream, I understand. I understand. God is God and we are not. He always does it his way, never in man's way. When Toby opened his eyes, he noticed he was lying in the grass. In the distance he spotted trees. Did he know these trees? They looked familiar. He rubbed his eyes and looked around. Stones, there were the magical stones. And there, right in front of him, was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. Skye stood before him and smiled at him so sweetly that for a moment, Toby thought he had entered heaven. Toby jumped up and instantly fell back again as he cringed in pain. His leg was still badly hurt. But it didn't matter, he was home and Skye was with him. Skye ran up to him and tried to help him up. Then he saw Ringjin. He stood on the side and looked at his feet. Toby smiled. Ringjin, what did you do? Now you are stuck with us in another time. Is this your time? Toby, Ringjin asked. It looks somewhat the same as mine. Toby smiled as Skye helped him up. Ringjin, you fool, he said, but his voice was warm and full of love. But I am so glad to see you. Ringjin pressed his lips together. I couldn't see you two just disappear. Too much has happened. Toby shook his head and then he kissed Skye deep and long. "We are home, my angel," he finally said. "It was a long journey, but we are home." Skye's eyes shone. "Let's go back to Gillesbanes, Toby. I can't wait to see the others." The others, Toby stopped. He thought of his brothers. What had happened to William and to Hamish? Would they find them alive and well in the village? At last he spoke. "Yes, Skye, let's go home and see the others. I would like to see Taherlach too. I have some questions for him." "I am so hungry," Skye added. "I think I could eat a whole chicken all by myself." "A chicken?" Ringan asked. "You still eat chicken in your time?" "Yes," Ringan. Toby smiled, "and many other things too. I think you will be right at home here." "Then let's sing," Ringan said. And before Toby could answer, he started to sing. Epilogue. What a joyful reunion it was. That evening, the town of Gillesbanes was celebrating the return of Toby and Skye. At that time, Hamish, his new wife Isla, and William and Caitlin had not yet returned. That happened later and well. We won't go into that yet, for those are stories in themselves and they deserve your full and undivided attention. Taherlach took it upon himself to teach Toby more about the god of Columba, and he and Ringan even made a pilgrimage to the Isle of Iona at one point. Toby eventually took over the leadership of the clan and Ringan became his right-hand man. After Toby and Skye were shot back in time, Colbardus arranged a ship for Hager, and this time the Viking warrior did finally make it back home without another shipwreck. He eventually moved away from the Viking village with his wife Thorgunna and his son Gamli. Colbardus had talked to him about the one true God and how this God could actually be reached through prayer. And Colbardus had said, "This God doesn't care so much for your Viking violence." The words of the old man had never left him, and at last Hager and his family sailed back to Scotland to learn more about the God that Colbardus had told him about. He started a new settlement on the north coast of Scotland where he peacefully lived out his years. Well, that's about it. That was the amazing story of Toby MacChonaill and how he got reunited with his beloved Skye O'Cain, all of which would not have been possible without a little help from the god of Columba. I know this is a true story and it is all based on a true account. How do I know that? That's simple. I heard the story myself. My father told me and he was there himself. You see, my name is Ffrenjin MacNill. I am the son of Ringan MacNill, the son of Douglas MacNill, although I never met my grandfather. But I told you this story exactly as he told it to me. The end. Thank you for listening. Here at PureRead, we aim to serve you, our dear readers and listeners, with good, clean Christian stories. You can be assured that any PureRead book you pick up will not only be hugely enjoyable but free of any objectionable content. We are deeply thankful to you for choosing our books. Your support means that we can continue to provide stories like the one you have just listened to. Please like and subscribe to our channel. That way you'll be the first to hear when new stories arrive for your enjoyment. To browse our range of clean and wholesome titles, go to pureread.com. God bless you. And thank you again for listening.